Real quick before we get into the video, I want to foreclose that in my Kingdom Hearts analyses, I'm looking into the plots and stories of each game in the order featured in the collection titled The Story So Far, followed by Kingdom Hearts 3, with the exception of 358 over 2 days and Kingdom Hearts 2 being switched so I can experience them in release order. Because release order and canonical chronological order are not the same in Kingdom Hearts, as I spend time going through the games one at a time, each one's plot and story inclusions will be factored into my overall understanding of them later. And I guess I should warn that this video will include some spoilers. Even though it's nearly 20 years old now and I shouldn't need to include a warning in a long analysis that you, the viewer, clicked on, I'm doing so anyway because I know if I don't, I could end up with salty comments. Besides, what's the point of a critical analysis and review if I can't spoil it by overanalyzing it? So now, without further ado, let's get into Kingdom Hearts' final mix, a critical analysis. The day that one of the world's most renowned and best-selling game series of all time collided in a cooking pot with the supernovas that are many of Disney's greatest animated films ever made was the day that Kingdom Hearts was born. Kind of. As long as an elevator is a cooking pot and executives from Square Enix and Disney meeting in one is the spark that set the heating fire alight. The concept of Kingdom Hearts has understandably turned off numerous prospective players over the years, and I've got to admit that I am part of that audience that was initially hesitant to play it, and due to complex name conventions that the series has made up for itself, I was even more reluctant to dive into the series, because seriously, what the hell is up with these re-release names? But now that I've actually played through the first title, I've finally gotten, well, probably only ankle deep into the tempest that is this mash of both pre-existing and original fantasy worlds. Hardcore fans of this series probably already know this, but the comment that I made about 2 paragraphs back wasn't a joke. Square Enix, the developer behind Final Fantasy, had at one point shared an office building in Japan with Disney, and Square Enix had been considering making an open-world RPG title. But those behind the idea figured that without some form of material that was already very well known internationally, the plan might not work too well. With a hard stroke of luck, however, one of the creators of Kingdom Hearts had found himself in an elevator with a Disney executive, and with a quick stroke of genius, that's where they struck up a conversation. A deal was apparently come to shortly afterwards, and the rest is history. As I briefly pointed out in this video's introduction, the very strange concept of Kingdom Hearts combined with incredibly confusing names for the game collections made me hesitant to purchase and play the games, but earlier this year, a friend of mine finally convinced me to take the dive and make the purchase. I shortly afterwards played through all of the Disney content of this first game, and then proceeded to quit. Little did I know that that's right when the game's story begins to exponentially increase in quality. From what I could tell, the story of Kingdom Hearts in general was very vague, if not straight up boring or bland, at least up until the first original world following the lineup of Disney adventures the plot takes us on. That's not to say it was bad, it was just a little samey. After being introduced to the game's mechanics through the admittedly incredibly long and boring tutorial chapter and the strangely satisfying and well-designed Destiny Islands, we, playing as Sora, are plopped into Traverse Town and join up with Donald and Goofy from the Disney universe with 2 separate goals in mind. First, to seal up a bunch of keyholes in different worlds in order to keep darkness from overtaking them, and second, to find King Mickey, who just seems to be gone for no apparent reason that we know of yet. Following the joining of Donald, Goofy, and Sora, the main plot of Kingdom Hearts leads us through a whole slew of different Disney worlds with the same few tasks in mind. Destroy a bunch of Heartless, stop the big bad guys whenever possible, and most importantly to find the keyhole in each world and seal it. Although minor character development and some plot moves forward with each passing world, this cycle can feel a little ridiculous and sometimes almost painful to play after a while, especially when taking into consideration the gameplay loop, which I will get into in Heading 3. Now, if there's something I will admit I regret doing, or rather not doing, the first time around, I honestly should have continued into the original content of Kingdom Hearts the first time that I tried playing the game, because the story, lore drops and reveals, the satisfying closes to somewhat loose threads that we as players may not have even known were loose, and the character development that happens from Hollow Bastion through the end of the game is honestly incredible. Let's look into some specific pros and cons of Kingdom Hearts' plot, shall we? First, I want to discuss the main things that I think don't really work with the story of Kingdom Hearts and its construction. Primarily, something that I hinted at before is the way that the story progresses only little bits at a time with each world. Minor development and reveals occur between worlds and such, but the main problem I have with this style of storytelling is that each world has little in the way of an internal conflict to solve. We already know as soon as we reach each world that our goal there is to find the keyhole and then get the heck out of there, and there isn't really much else. To be fair though, In each of the Disney worlds, there is one major internal conflict that happens primarily with that world's villain siding with the Heartless for whatever reason, whether it be for power, or to get that world's princess, or whatever. But other than that, the interest that I personally had in each world rested only in the hands of how much I liked the movies they were based on, the voice acting and delivery of dialogue, combined with how balanced, easy, or difficult each was to fight through, or how difficult they were to even figure out in the first place, which I will again get into in Heading 3. TLDR, the basic story and progression style is real simple in a way that I personally didn't enjoy, but other than that, the only real gripe that I do have with the story overall is how so many things are so vague and seemingly random. Most of these vague and random concepts become incredible payoffs in the last few hours of the plot, yes, but as a new player experiencing these out-of-the-blue things in the first several hours of the game, we're just forced to live with confusion. Or, as was the case with me, you can just forget about those strange scenes in the first place because they make no sense, and then figure out at the end of the game the importance of them with the payoff. Either way, I didn't find it to be the best construction, even if I really enjoyed the payoffs in the end. The particular things I did really highly enjoy about Kingdom Hearts lie primarily in the payoffs that I've spoken so much about up to this point. But the real question is, what are the story payoffs that occur during the story that I do like so much? First, early on in the story, in the cave on Destiny Islands, Sora comes across a mysterious hooded figure with a very seductive voice. Yes, I said seductive, because it is. Anyway, later on in Hollow Bastion, we see in a cutscene where Riku encounters the same figure, and we learn that the mysterious being is Ansem, the Seeker of Darkness, whose reports about his research is one of the types of items we can obtain throughout the game. It's a cool reveal, and very effective as long as you've read through the journal entries. Otherwise, it might seem like a simple or whatever type of reveal for a one-off game. Aside from this big story moment, there is one other incredible payoff I enjoyed a lot. This occurred with a very confusing scene early on in the game, again in the cave on Destiny Island. On the night that Destiny Island was about to be swallowed up by darkness, Sora enters the cave and encounters a zombie-like Kairi who almost seems to merge with Sora, which has no explanation for a long time. To explain the confusion, the real explanation is that Kairi's heart at that moment decided to take refuge with Sora's while her physical body was swooped somewhere else, presumably to Neverland, since that's where she is located by Riku. Later in the game, when Sora gets the navigation gummy pieces that he needs to travel to Hollow Bastion following the Disney worlds, he hears Kairi's voice and kind of experiences one of Kairi's memories, or something. At the time, I was completely lost because of this, but understanding that Kairi's heart is with Sora at this time, it begins to actually make sense, and also brings a whole new depth to Sora's character development following viewing the discourse from Kairi's grandmother to her as a child. It was also rather funny and strangely cute to run around as Heartless for a minute after probably my favorite boss in the game, and having Kairi bring Sora back into his normal form afterwards was effective in solidifying that payoff. Of course, another important topic to consider when critiquing a game is the very thing that makes it a game in the first place, the gameplay. I honestly have very mixed feelings on many of the gameplay elements of Kingdom Hearts Final Mix, though that's not to say I hated it all. Let me elaborate. First off, the main mechanic that you'll become familiar with, and the first thing I mostly don't like about the gameplay, is the combat. And when I say familiar, I mean very familiar. To describe what the combat is actually like, imagine spamming X on your PlayStation controller. That's basically it. Sometimes you need to use the D-pad to navigate to use magic or items, or summons if you're savvy and happen to remember that they exist, since I very much didn't. But even then you still select options in those menus with X. Long story short, the combat in Kingdom Hearts is extremely simple. It works, as long as you aren't doing an unbearable amount of fighting. The catch? You're always doing a lot of fighting, which is completely at the fault of the leveling system, something I have a love-hate relationship with. My general opinion is that the basics of how leveling in Kingdom Hearts works is explained well enough by how you play the game. Defeat any enemy, you get a certain amount of XP. Parry an enemy, you again get a certain amount of XP. Checking the status section of your menu shows you how much XP until you level up. The amount of XP that enemies grant you is based on the power level of the world you're currently in. It's rather simple, and actually works for that reason. The reason that I do hate it, however, is in some of the utilization of the system. Bosses between worlds increase so dramatically in difficulty, power, and defense that there's no way to be properly leveled for them unless you fight virtually every single enemy you come across in the world, which is a lot, all the time. I understand that this is basically the intention, but combined with the very repetitive fighting style, this gets real old real quick, hence why I mentioned that you become quite acquainted with battle in Kingdom Hearts, and for me at least, it wasn't a friendly acquaintance after playing for half a dozen hours. The most aggravating part of so much fighting is the fact that basically having to fight every group of enemies you come across to ensure proper leveling can just be beyond annoying when all you want to do is accomplish your next objective. Not to mention that I had quite the time leveling through Traverse Town for like 7 hours to do the final boss rush. But that's somewhat irrelevant since I made that personal choice so I could do those fights without as much trouble as the first time I tried the fights, which left me destroyed in-game and very tilted in real life. Aside from those issues, perhaps my biggest problem with the gameplay of Kingdom Hearts has got to be its general lack of direction, because it's bad. I feel like it's reasonable to not want too much hand-holding in a game, because otherwise it can be not very fun to play, if not outright annoying, but Kingdom Hearts does the complete opposite of that. It basically never tells you what you're supposed to do, or where you're supposed to go. Ever. Which is pretty ironic considering the fact that you essentially have the same basic tasks to do for each world. The lack of direction in this game actually got so bad a couple times that I actively wished I was being handheld during it, and heavily considered looking up guides to find the one small thing I was missing was. This happened especially in areas like Deep Jungle, where the world itself is larger than most, and the game never really fully tells you what your temporary goals are. I spent 50 to 100% more time in worlds like Atlantica and Deep Jungle solely because of this. I just had to go back and forth between areas for a long time feeling lost before the story would progress, and it was rather irritating. The truth is that you end up having to go around in loops and crazy patterns to achieve your goals. However, due to unique level design, each world still has its own identity despite this pattern of gameplay, and this would be fantastic if it wasn't so tedious. The rest of my complaints are just minor things, such as problems with the camera that I experienced, although some of those problems might have simply been because I just chose to play with a manual camera instead of the automatic one. I also didn't enjoy how the menu can be a little bit much to handle for a new player, particularly the item menu, where there are tons of items that you can equip, as well as plenty that you can't, plus some that you're supposed to just use in the menu itself. A specific example is that I didn't figure out until very late that all the random AP ups, defense ups, etc. were usable as permanent increases to my stats. That was 98% my fault. The 2% exists because those items were never given any explanation, so I didn't realize I could go into my menu and use them that way, which I do feel like was at least partially the game's fault. But by the time I started finding them in chests around worlds, I had already given up on personally putting in effort to try to understand the menu entirely, which was completely my problem. Now the last two things I thought were underexplained were synthesis and the gummy ship stuff that you do in Traverse Town. Synthesis was easy enough to figure out, although I never used it, but oh boy, the gummy stuff. Those routes are essentially just straight lines of boredom and sometimes irritation depending on your level of patience. Trust me, some of them feel like they take an entire year to travel through. Of course, I could have always built a new better ship. Or maybe not, because trying to learn how to build in the Gummy Garage is horrible. They list out 10 trillion text boxes of how to do things in it, but those boxes ironically explain nothing because there are so many of them that it all starts to just go in one ear and out the other by the 5 trillionth box, no matter how hard I try to concentrate on what they're saying. Not only that, but after the 10 trillionth box of instructions, the game literally tells you the rest is learning by doing. Okay, so you expect me to waste an entire year of my life learning how to actually make an optimized travel vessel that by this point in the game literally only gets used for traveling to new worlds because I can just warp to past worlds? Yeah, nah, I think I'll pass. When I finally did have to build a better ship in order to get to Hollow Bastion for the first time, I had issues. I wasted an hour not only trying to make a ship in the first place, but also trying to make a ship, any ship, that would be capable of getting me to Hollow Bastion. It was so bad that I just did not care how flipping ugly and nonsensical the creation was as long as it worked to get me to a new world. I'm aware this is really a non-issue, but for somebody who likes to at least try to make things look nice, it's an embarrassment of a flying vessel. Just look at this thing, it's an abomination! Long story short, Kingdom Hearts suffers very hard from first game syndrome, and there's no possible way to deny it. But now that I've taken a giant dump on this game's entire mechanical identity, let me try to at least brush off the mound by telling you about some things that I really enjoyed about the game's core non-story elements. Firstly, the enemy variety of this game is incredible. There are so many different types of enemies that it's strangely breathtaking. There is a small caveat, however, that sometimes the enemies can get old or really annoying to battle with having to fight them so much, but at its core, especially playing for the first time, being surprised by how many different types of basic mobs Kingdom Hearts throws at you is a real treat. Furthermore, the design of said enemies is great too. Each enemy feels really distinctly different with their own specific visual appearances, as well as their own attacks and spells that they can cast. I will reiterate that some of the enemies are incredibly annoying, if not just plain difficult, especially in overbearing groups such as in the End of the World, but that doesn't detract from how much time and care was obviously put into at least making the sheer number of enemies and their abilities. Some are unbalanced, but it's still cool to see so many foes with so many different moves. Finally, this next topic that I overall highly enjoyed actually gets a heading all to itself, and that is the category of bosses that Kingdom Hearts features and includes. Similar to the 2 bits about enemy variety and design, the boss variety is also very good. Granted, many of the bosses are Disney villains from actual pre-existing material, but the design of their mechanics was pretty great to see, especially in bosses that featured more than one phase or form. Truthfully, I did get irritated at bosses more often than I didn't, but looking back at most of them, their diversity and the adaptability of their attacks and mechanics was a centerpiece of the game. With that being said, there is a huge disparity in boss quality, without a doubt, fitting into several separate groups based on their difficulty and enjoyability. To explain what I mean, here are some examples. Bosses can be super simple, but really enjoyable to fight. The first boss that comes to mind that fits this description for me is Darkseid, the original boss you fight in the tutorial and when you have to leave Destiny Island in the beginning, as well as at the end before the second Ansem fight. Darkseid as a tutorial boss is really well balanced in my opinion. He's not too difficult and for a brand new player is still fun to learn and duel. Even when returning to the game to play through and ultimately finish, several months after my initial attempt to do so, I found myself enjoying fighting Darkseid. Conversely, fights like the 2 with Jafar really aren't that fun. Both versions of Jafar's fight are almost painfully easy, and while I usually prefer easy fights over hard ones, neither fight with Jafar to me were that fun because they just weren't interesting. They were just long waiting games that involved spamming that X button I've mentioned before when the long opportunities to do so arose, which was really bland. Similar to how a boss can be easy and fun, or easy and boring, bosses can also be hard and fun, or they can be difficult and a royal pain in the butt. When I fought Maleficent in her dragon form, I got super aggravated because the boss is very difficult and terribly balanced. Many of her attacks do way too much damage, the amount of ways she can damage you is insane, and a lot of the time she's literally spamming her attacks in a way that you're lucky to get a full combo in on her when she does finally open herself up. This also doesn't mention the fact that the only place you can damage her for some reason is her head, which is a tiny target on a giant enemy that can damage you when she simply moves her head from side to side. That's hard, and definitely not fun. But on the other hand, there is a particular boss that was pretty difficult, but really fun to fight, and that was the second fight with Riku, / the first fight with Ansem, whatever. The Riku Ansem fight in Hollow Bastion was super enjoyable to me because of a few reasons. The fight featured 3 separate phases that were all well done and pretty balanced. Throughout each one, the boss has plenty of tells to remember for attacks, but none of them are super hard to miss or deceptive, which is enjoyable. As the fight goes on and becomes slightly more difficult and tense with each passing minute, you have to add more of his attacks to your brain and make sure you're watching for each one. But after not too long, it's not that hard to have them all down pat, despite the minor brain test and being prepared for them all. The fight is very intuitive. To be concise, the Riku Ansem fight is a difficult one, perhaps not as hard as Maleficent's dragon fight, but it was still hard, yet I had a blast with it. It all really just goes to show that the little things can make a big difference. Oh, and speaking of little things making a big difference, I suppose to wrap up my thoughts on Kingdom Hearts, I must acknowledge the way it thinks of itself. Kingdom Hearts sets out to be a silly game telling a serious story, and it works because of that. Throughout, there are little things that occur, like Donald breaking the fourth wall and pulling the camera to view him when he says something, that make it obvious that the game is not at all trying to take itself seriously. The reason I love this is because the concept in general is jarring, and there are plenty of instances where it is impossible to take the game seriously as a player. So for the game to already anticipate that, acknowledge it, and thus promptly build off of it was a good strategy. And on the topic of the plot, Kingdom Hearts taking its story so seriously still works despite the silliness because it allows for fans to dig into it, especially later in the series where I'm aware the plot gets very convoluted. Despite visually attracting children, the story can attract adults just as easily. Much like many Disney movies, it's easy for both groups alike to get something out of it. In general, the things I dislike about Kingdom Hearts outnumber the amount of truly praiseworthy things for me, but don't be fooled, because I'm a quality over quantity kind of guy. Even though there are a massive amount of things I complained about in this analysis, the truth is I still had a fun time playing the game, and I'm glad that I have a friend who has helped me to feel the desire and willingness to dig into what the series has to offer for me as a gamer. Now that I've given you my thoughts, let me know what you think about this game. But avoid spoilers for the series because although Kingdom Hearts as a saga of games is almost as old as I am, I haven't seen or played anything past this first game and want to be surprised by them. If you are interested in seeing my reaction to them as I play them, as well as many other games between, consider subscribing for some Let's Plays and numerous more in-depth breakdowns and reviews similar to this one. And with that in mind, stay safe you guys, and I'll be back again in the next one.